Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back. So just a few weeks ago, IGN spoke with Dogma creator Hideaki Itsuno in this massive, several pages long written interview, and surprisingly, I've not seen much coverage of this anywhere, which is absolutely crazy to me because they covered all sorts of really interesting stuff, diving into what he believes is special about the franchise, the lessons learned from the original game, and their overall vision for the sequel, Dragon's Dogma 2. So today, what I want to do is go over some of the highlights and stuff that I found most interesting from this behemoth of an interview. So let's jump right into it. So they started out with IGN asking Itsuno what kind of game Dragon's Dogma 2 is. His response was, "We wanted to make this an action-packed experience that takes place in an open world. It's an action RPG, an open world game, and a game with action combat by Capcom, which means there's been tons of work put into that part of it, primarily by our Devil May Cry team." And it is curious to me that his primary reference here is for combat Devil May Cry. While I don't doubt the lineage of who's making this game, when looking at footage and while playing the original, the first game that comes to mind certainly wasn't Devil May Cry as comparison. Other than them being character action games, DMC is just much faster paced with all sorts of crazy movement and these over attack combos and attacks and huge animations, whereas Dragon's Dogma, both 1 and this upcoming sequel, is much more methodical, rooted, and seems to line up closely with another Capcom franchise this little series of games you may have heard of called Monster Hunter. Yes, that's the most obvious comparison, at least at a glance, but that is also besides the point, as he was simply saying that it's the Devil May Cry team who's working on Dragon's Dogma Combat 1 and the sequel. In fact, Itsuno himself, if you didn't know, was a lead developer for Devil May Cry, where he used his prior knowledge from working on fighting games to help develop Devil May Cry's combat, and then from Devil May Cry he moved on to Dragon's Dogma, and that experience informed how they made combat for that game. Even if the combat isn't a surface level one-for-one, a direct comparison to the Devil May Cry franchise, they look very different. It looks a lot more like Monster Hunter, but it is rooted in experience with the Devil May Cry franchise, but for what it's worth. Continuing to answer the question of what kind of game Dragon's Dogma 2 is, Itsuno said, "What's most notable of all is that it's a single-player online party action game. Even though you play it on your own, you can experience the enjoyment of getting to play as a group. To be more specific, there are characters known as pawns or followers that accompany your character, the protagonist. You recruit one on your own, and then you borrow 2 created by other players to form a 4-player party." Now, as mentioned in prior videos on this game, the pawn system is one of the more interesting things about the Dragon's Dogma franchise. They are so much more than just AI companions. They learn and grow as they adventure and fight alongside you, and then use that knowledge in future endeavors, being able to actually help guide you, help solve puzzles and find objectives or locate enemy weak points. Outside of you having your own personally created pawn, you recruit those 2 other pawns from other players and then are able to make use of whatever knowledge they acquired when adventuring with whoever made them for the obstacles that you are facing against. It is, I will continue and forever probably gush about this system. It's one of the best iterations of like AI companions I've ever seen in an RPG. Now, the next question had IGN asking about, the original game. It was so ambitious. What in particular were they proud of? Here he talked about how falling in love with online multiplayer games in the early 2000s, he really enjoyed them, but hated one particular thing about them, which was dealing with other players. The direct quote here, "I started thinking about making this game around 2001 or 2002. Online games weren't played on connections that were nearly as fast as today's back then, but I still revered them. I had a chance to play some myself, and they were like the worlds I'd always dreamed of, but at the same time, I found them surprisingly annoying. These were games you could be able to play anytime and anywhere in theory, yet I'd have to gather with all my friends to start at a specific time, or I'd feel bad about going to use the bathroom, or I'd get mad at middle schoolers who wouldn't type politely in chat. Because of all of that, I find myself wanting to play online games while hoping to avoid these kinds of annoying experiences and not having to be so considerate of others." And much of what he's saying here will be familiar to anyone who grew up or still today plays MMOs, games with these massive worlds to explore and tons of other players running around. While those players are a big part of the experience and what I love about the genre, they're also a part of what can make it a total hassle. The time it takes to form a party to take on group content, waiting for everyone in that group to get to the dungeon, having one or multiple of those people then go AFK at some point while inside the dungeon, or maybe halfway through the run, having one person realize that they forgot to repair their gear or to buy water so they're always out of mana, or to change their spec, at which point they have to leave the dungeon and go do whatever needs doing, and then getting to the end of the dungeon, defeating a boss and having, I don't know, a hunter ninja loot your best in slot spell power cloth caster chest piece, even though it has literally no value to them whatsoever. This has already happened to me like multiple times in BFD. Those of you who know will know. I'll leave it at that. Or maybe you're questing alone in the open world, you're just trying to get some experience, level up, grind some currency, whatever, only to be killed and camped by the enemy faction for hours and hours. If you have played any MMOs over the past 20 plus years, odds are you've encountered every single one of these scenarios, either on the receiving or maybe sometimes on the giving end of that exchange. I love the MMO genre, but it is not without its annoyances. That is absolutely true. Now, what does any of this have to do with Dragon's Dogma? Well, Itsuno went on to say that he wanted to make a game that did two things. He wanted to create an RPG that wasn't a chore to play, and wanted to make an RPG you could play alone that still felt like an online experience. He said, "I created Dragon's Dogma by combining these two ideas. I'm proud that it feels like playing with friends even though you're alone, and that it's an RPG with action elements that feel just as fun as all-out action games." And outside of the combat, I would certainly say that they did a great job with that particular element. While playing with AI companions, it's never going to be the same or as dynamic as playing with real people. The pawns are about the closest attempt I've ever seen in any RPG I played. With all the different interactions that they can have with you, with each other, with the enemies and bosses, and with the environment, how they acquire knowledge and share those details with players, like I've mentioned in prior videos. If you kill a pack of wolves, clear a cave of goblins, track down a griffin, whatever it is you do, pawns gain that knowledge on how to more effectively do that thing. They also gain knowledge on all of the quests that you do, NPCs you chat with, the bosses you fight, and then on top of that, the pawns that you recruit from other players can share the info that they gathered while playing with them and help you with quests and objectives that you haven't done. It is such a cool system, and it really makes these pawns feel way more alive than most RPG companions, who typically just boil down to being extra hands to help with you in combat encounters and occasional quip machines, which, hey, you know, pawns do be quipping. There's no question about that. Lots of quips with the pawns. They're saying a lot of one-liners, but they're also a whole lot more than that. It's such a fleshed out system. Now, the next few questions in the interview were a bit about the development of the original game, where we learned they had actually intended and tested having the Beastren race of characters in the game, but the tech for the original just wasn't there. Rendering all of their hair bogged down the system when there was too many Beastren on screen at one time. That's not a joke. That's actually what they said. They wanted Beastren. The hair was just too much for the game console. Also, in making the original, he mentioned that Capcom was really caught by surprise with just how much time and manpower it took to create this open world RPG, whereas right from the start here with the sequel, they were prepared for the scale, for the amount of dev time, and for the budget requirements, and as a result, this sequel is much closer to what Itsuno had in mind when creating the original. And we also got confirmation once again that the game world is roughly 4 times the size of the first one. But with this large size, they wanted to make sure that it didn't feel too big, that it became boring, or that the player felt like they were just wandering through vastly empty spaces. Because when you hear big, it can be good, but it can also be overwhelming. If you've, like myself, played many open world games, you know what we're talking about. So here Itsuno said, "I don't want to go too far and make people think I'm exaggerating, but we've placed items on the map and figured out ways to guide the player's eye so that there aren't any moments when they feel bored. This is something that other action games often do as well, and one of the basic elements in such games is the ability to see your destination while being unsure of how to get there, moving from scene to scene. We were able to give a lot of consideration to this kind of map making with the gray and white box stages before we really sat down to make them. And I'll concur here that in my experience, this is absolutely a staple of any great RPG. Seeing that cool looking thing, be it a castle, a tower, ruins, whatever it is, seeing it off in the distance and then navigating a path to it, while then also coming across some surprises along the way. You think of Skyrim, you think of Dark Souls, you think of Elden Ring, you think of modern day Zeldas. Really, any great 3D modern day RPG has that sort of thing at play, and it really adds a lot to the experience and the exploration and adventure of those worlds. After a brief portion of the interview talking about the game's lore, they then moved on to combat, which is something I'm very interested in. Specifically, they talked about Dragon Dogma's lack of lock-on combat and the fact that dodge is restricted to only certain vocations, to which Itsuno said, "Ideally for me, a game doesn't need lock-on. In a perfect world, players can't choose who to lock on with the controls, and instead the game decides who the player locks on to on its own. Tons of enemies appear in this game as well, making it very difficult to manually lock on every time." Now, I'll say this can be true. Typically, I'm more in favor of giving as much control as possible to the player, but this has been done successfully with many games, with a caveat though that it has to be done well when the game is deciding who to attack for you, right? Like, removing manual control is something that can feel very jarring when it's done poorly. Typically, I will prefer that games are either 100% player controlled directional attacks like the Souls series, or manual locking. If you have that in your game, I want to once again be able to swap as I please. But having a game that is mostly free control with some attack assisting, that is certainly a valid option so long as it's done well. Like I said, I thought combat felt great in the original, so I can only hope that they have just further refined it here in the sequel. And then he went on to say, as far as the dodging, it is fun to have in battles. Dodge is great if you can do it, but I think it is a very difficult maneuver, so ideally I want to avoid making a game that requires the ability to dodge if you want to have fun. So they've basically, from what I can tell here, looked to design combat encounters where you can dodge with some vocations, but it isn't absolutely required. There will be certain characters that you can play as that do have the ability to dash or dodge, but others that don't. And Itsuno talked about this as well, mentioning that vocations that can't dodge have other systems and techniques that still let them fight effectively. We want players to go ahead and pick the vocation they want based on the actions they're best at. Making something all-powerful will just lead to everyone using that. I don't think an RPG like that would be fun, which is why dodging is limited to specific vocations. So obviously, lots of different ways you can do combat. You can do tab target. You can do full-on free control action. You can do assisted attack combat. Then there's many, many variations and combinations of all of those things in between. I thought combat was totally fine in the original Dragon's Dogma. They're going along that line of mostly free gaming, but some attack assist in the mix. I think that's fine. And if anything, I think it's great that not every single character you can play as in this game is just going to be constantly dodge rolling around everything. I love Souls games, but that is like a predominant focus, at least in the way I've played Soul games, because you can go light and go full roll dodge. That's just what I always end up doing. And while those games do also have the ability to go like heavy and be focused on blocking or focused on parrying or whatever, there are different ways to play Souls games here. I'm not trying to undermine one thing to build up another. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm just stating that there are different ways you can approach combat, and it just seems like those combat playstyles are going to be built into the vocation that you pick. So you can pick the dodging nimble character, but you can also pick the blocking character, and you can pick the character who just does nothing but walk, but has other measures to deal with big bosses and charging and enemies coming in different directions and all sorts of stuff. They've just basically surfaced it different, rather than just like your equipment load and the weapons you use. It's going to be the vocation that you pick that sort of determines what kind of playstyle you'll end up having when you play this game. Now, after this, there were several other questions here where they talked a bit about some of the game's role-playing mechanics. They talked about having this in-depth character creator, which from what we saw does look pretty good. They also talked about things like NPC relationships in the game, romancing. They talked about the inspirations for the world of Dragon's Dogma, as well as the addition of things like large-scale enemies like Talos, and lots of the environmental interactions like destroying bridges challenges with explosives. And these were fair questions with decent answers, but most of the bulk of the interesting stuff is what I have covered prior. If you want to get a lot more of this though, because as I mentioned, this was a very, very lengthy interview, I'll put a link to it in the description below if you want to read through it for yourself. But I do want to quickly go before we wrap up here with one final thing. As they wrapped up, Itsuno had a bit of a message for franchise newcomers where he said, as for people who don't know much about the game but want to try it out because they heard it was fun, I feel like after all the effort and time the whole team has put into creating this game's pawns, they can almost act like a friend who sits beside you to give advice after playing through the game themselves. That's why I feel like you should be able to have plenty of fun even if you're coming to it with that attitude. So please just rely on your pawns and learn what you need to from those that your friends have made. They've already gone through the game and will teach you what you need to know. So you should be able to play through the game even if you're not super committed, as long as you lean on them. I hope you give it a try. And hey, I'm right there with you. Itsuno cheerleading on the pawn system. And again, it's one of the things that I thought they did so well in the original, and it seems like they're making really great strides and improvements here in Dragon's Dogma 2. So I'm happy to just gush about them till the cows come home. I will continue to in future Dragon's Dogma 2 videos as well. But yeah, I mean, this game's coming up not too long. It's going to be here shortly, and I'm just really, really excited for it. I intend to make some additional videos leading up to release as more new information comes out. Hopefully we get some like hands-on time. If we're going to get a review build, I'll be sure to check that out as well, because I am very much so looking forward to Dragon's Dogma 2. But that's going to do it for a little bit of a recap of this interview that IGN did a few weeks back. Like I said, I didn't really see a lot of people cover this thing, which just absolutely blew my mind. If you want to get more info and details, again, check out that link in the description below. I'll link you directly to the article if you want to read through it yourself. But really, combing through it, that's most of the interesting stuff, at least from my perspective. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. Thanks as always for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. All right? Take it easy.